The vain masquerade was at its glittering peak when Esperanza Jensen felt the first crack in her perfectly constructed facade. Beneath the cascade of a crystal chandelier, surrounded by London's most elegant society, she stood motionless in her dark gown, a figure of ethereal composure with silver blonde hair that caught the light like moonlight on ice. Her piercing gaze tracked Julian Vane, her fiancé, as he slipped behind a velvet curtain with a young heiress, his laughter echoing back into the ballroom like a knife wrapped in silk. The air hung thick with the scent of lilies and champagne, but underneath it all, Esperanza could hear the whispers, the cruel speculation about Julian's gambling debts, his wandering eye, and the doomed bride who would soon be cast aside. What the whispering guests could not know, what Julian himself had failed to grasp, was that Esperanza Jensen was no victim awaiting her fate. She had discovered his scheme weeks ago, the plan to break their engagement after securing access to her dowry, the secret meetings with creditors, the forged documents bearing her family's seal. While Julian believed he was orchestrating her downfall, Esperanza had been quietly assembling evidence of every fraudulent debt, every forged signature, every lie he'd told to London's banking houses. She had made a choice then, a calculated one. Rather than expose him prematurely and risk being dismissed as a scorned woman, she would wait. She would let him reveal himself, let him grow confident enough to make his move in public, where his disgrace would be total and irreversible. Tonight, as Julian prepared to discard her before the cream of society, Esperanza was ready to do more than survive his betrayal, she was ready to destroy him with it. The moment arrived with theatrical precision. Julian emerged from behind the velvet curtain, his cravat askew, a self-satisfied smirk playing at his lips. He approached Esperanza with the bearing of a man who believed victory was already his. The orchestra played a waltz. The chandeliers glittered. And Julian Vane reached for Esperanza's gloved hand with all the gentleness of a man about to deliver a killing blow. "My dear," he said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "perhaps we should speak privately about our arrangement." Esperanza smiled. It was not the smile of a woman about to be humiliated. It was the smile of a huntress who had finally cornered her prey. "By all means, Julian," she replied, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed ballroom. "Let us speak of arrangements. Let us speak of the £40,000 you borrowed against my dowry without my consent. Let us speak of the forged promissory notes bearing my father's signature. Let us speak of your debts to Lord Ashworth, to the Hartley brothers, to every creditor from Mayfair to the docks." The colour drained from Julian's face. Around them, the whispers transformed into gasps. Lady Pemberton's fan snapped shut. Lord Ashworth stepped forward from the crowd, his expression thunderous. Esperanza continued, her voice steady as steel. "I have copies of every fraudulent document, witnessed and notarized. I have testimony from 3 separate banking houses. And I have a ledger, your ledger, Julian, detailing every penny you intended to steal from me and my family." She withdrew a folded document from her bodice and held it aloft. The orchestra had stopped playing. The entire ballroom stood frozen, 300 pairs of eyes fixed on the scandal unfolding before them. "So yes, my dear," Esperanza said softly, dangerously, "let us speak of our arrangement. Consider it dissolved." Julian lunged for the document, but Lord Ashworth's hand clamped down on his shoulder. "I think not, Vane. We have business to discuss with the magistrate." As Julian was led away, protesting, pleading, finally weeping, Esperanza stood alone in the center of the ballroom. She had won. She had protected her family's legacy. She had reclaimed her dignity. But as the shocked crowd began to close in around her, murmuring their mixture of admiration and scandal-hungry curiosity, she realized with sudden clarity that she had also made herself untouchable. No respectable family would take her in now. She had chosen victory over propriety. She had chosen truth over the comfortable lie of a scorned woman's silence. She had won everything and lost everything in the same breath. Rain lashed against the cobblestones as Esperanza fled the Vane estate. She had refused a dozen offers of carriages, a dozen false sympathies from women who would gossip about her ruin over tea the very next morning. Her dark gown clung to her frame, her carefully arranged hair falling in wet silver strands around her face. Thunder rolled across the London sky. She stood on the rain-slicked street, trying to decide which direction led away from everything she had known. Back to her family's house, where her father would receive her with bitter disappointment. To a modest inn, where she might hide until the scandal died down, if it ever did. Forward into the unknown, with no name, no prospects, and no allies. That was when she heard it, the sharp crack of hooves against stone. Through the sheets of rain, a carriage emerged. Not just any carriage, this was a vehicle of unmistakable power. Black lacquered wood polished to a mirror shine. Gold filigree that caught the lamplight even through the downpour. 2 midnight horses that moved with the controlled power of thoroughbreds. And on the door, a crest she recognized immediately, the crowned wolf of Blackwood. The Duke. The carriage rolled to a stop before her, and the door swung open. Inside, barely visible in the shadowed interior, sat Stephen Cannon, Duke of Blackwood. Even seated, he radiated an authority that made lesser men step aside. His face was all sharp angles and cold assessment, a man who had built an empire on calculated risks and ruthless precision. He and Julian had been rivals for years, their enmity the subject of countless society rumors. "Miss Jensen," the Duke said, his voice a low rumble that somehow carried over the rain. "You've caused quite the spectacle tonight." Esperanza lifted her chin. "I have no regrets, Your Grace." "I didn't suggest you should." A hint of something of amusement? Approval flickered in his dark eyes. "Get in the carriage." "I prefer to walk." "In this storm?" "To where, exactly?" The Duke leaned forward slightly, and Esperanza could see the shrewd intelligence in his gaze. "Your family's door, where your father will lock you away in the country to preserve what's left of your reputation. A friend's house, where you'll be a charity case whispered about for the rest of your days." Each word landed like a blow because each word was true. "I have a different proposition," the Duke continued. "A marriage of convenience. You need a name powerful enough to withstand scandal. I need," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I need an heir and a hostess intelligent enough to navigate the viper's nest that is London society. You've proven tonight that you have both the courage and the cunning for such a role." Esperanza's breath caught. "You're proposing marriage? To me? After what just happened?" "Especially after what just happened." The Duke's expression remained unreadable. Julian Vane was a fool who couldn't recognize a strategic asset when he had one. "I am not Julian Vane. This would be a business arrangement, nothing more. You would have your own apartments, your own funds, your own life. In exchange, you would bear the Blackwood name and manage my social obligations. When I die, you would be a wealthy dowager. Your children, our children, would be among the most powerful in England. And if I refuse, then I wish you well in your alternative prospects." The Duke sat back, his hand resting on the door handle. "But decide now, Miss Jensen. This offer will not be repeated." Esperanza stood in the pouring rain, water running in rivulets down her face, her ruined gown heavy around her legs. Behind her lay the wreckage of her old life. Before her, in the shadow of the Duke's carriage, lay a gamble that terrified her more than Julian's betrayal ever had. Because Julian had offered her a comfortable lie. The Duke was offering her an uncomfortable truth, power without love, security without warmth, survival without surrender. She thought of her mother, who had married for love and died young, leaving her daughter to navigate a world that valued transaction over tenderness. She thought of her father, who had nearly lost everything to Julian's schemes. She thought of the whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life if she returned home in disgrace. And she thought of the woman she had been tonight, fearless, strategic, unbreakable. Esperanza Jensen stepped forward and climbed into the Duke's carriage. The journey north took 3 days. Esperanza and the Duke barely spoke. He spent his time reviewing correspondence, his quill scratching across parchment in the swaying carriage. She watched the landscape transform from London's grey sophistication to the wild, windswept moors of the North Country. With each mile, the world grew colder, darker, more forbidding. And yet, paradoxically, Esperanza felt something inside her chest begin to loosen. Blackwood Keep rose from the moorland like something out of a Gothic tale, all dark stone and narrow windows, turrets silhouetted against storm-grey skies. It was beautiful in a harsh, uncompromising way. It made no apologies for what it was. Neither, Esperanza decided, would she. The staff received her with formal courtesy. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, no relation to the Duke, despite the shared name, showed her to apartments that were larger than her entire family home. His Grace keeps to the East Wing, Mrs. Blackwood explained. You'll have the West Wing entirely to yourself, my lady. He doesn't. His Grace doesn't entertain much. I see, Esperanza said, though she didn't, not really. That evening, she dined with the Duke in a hall large enough to seat 50 but set for only 2. They sat at opposite ends of a table that emphasized the vast distance between them. The Duke ate methodically, efficiently, as if dining were simply another task to complete. We'll marry in 3 weeks, he announced between courses. A small ceremony. I've already obtained the license. Afterward, you may redecorate your apartments as you see fit. There's a budget. Why? Esperanza interrupted. The Duke looked up, his expression cool. I beg your pardon. Why this? Why me? You could have any woman in London. Why offer marriage to a scandal-soaked woman you barely know? For a long moment, the Duke said nothing. Then, surprisingly, he set down his fork. Because you remind me that strategic marriages need not be entered into blindly. You went into your engagement with Julian Vane knowing exactly who he was. I watched you at society events for months, Miss Jensen. I saw how you managed him, how you protected your family's interests while maintaining the fiction of devoted fiancé. That takes intelligence. That takes control. You were watching me. I watch everyone. It's how one survives in our world. The Duke's eyes met hers across the expanse of table. I need someone who understands that survival requires calculation. That strength sometimes means appearing weak. That the greatest victories are won not on battlefields but in ballrooms. And love? Esperanza asked quietly. Where does that factor into your calculations? It doesn't. The Duke's voice was flat, final. Love is a luxury I cannot afford. This marriage is a strategic alliance. I suggest you think of it the same way. Esperanza should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been disappointment. Very well, Your Grace. A strategic alliance it is. The marriage took place in Blackwood Keep's small chapel. No guests, no celebration, no pretense of romance. Esperanza wore a simple grey dress. The Duke wore black. The vicar spoke the words in a monotone that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. When the Duke placed the ring on Esperanza's finger, his hand was cold and steady. You may kiss the bride, the vicar said. The Duke leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to Esperanza's cheek. Professional. Perfunctory. Perfect for what this marriage was supposed to be. Except Esperanza felt the slight hesitation before he pulled away. Except she saw the way his jaw tightened as he stepped back. Except for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something vulnerable flash across his normally impassive face. The first month passed in careful distance. Esperanza spent her days exploring the keep and its grounds. She discovered a library that rivaled any in London, filled with books on history, philosophy, science. She found a conservatory that someone had once loved but now stood neglected, glass panels dusty, plants struggling in their pots. She explored the moors, walking for miles in the sharp northern wind, feeling more alive than she had in years. The Duke remained a ghost in his own house. She would see him occasionally at breakfast, where they would exchange pleasantries about the weather and the estate management. He worked constantly, she realized, correspondence, ledgers, meetings with his stewards and solicitors. The Duke of Blackwood might be one of the wealthiest men in England, but he worked harder than any labourer. One evening, Esperanza discovered why. She had gotten lost in the keep's eastern wing and stumbled upon what appeared to be the Duke's private study. The door stood ajar. Inside, she could see him hunched over his desk, his face illuminated by candlelight, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. She should have left. Their arrangement didn't include comfort or companionship. But something made her knock softly on the door frame. "Your Grace?" He looked up, startled. "Lady Blackwood. Is something wrong?" "No, Esperanza hesitated. "You look tired." "I am managing an estate, 3 shipping concerns, and investments in 7 different industries. Tired is my natural state." But there was no bite to his words, only a weary resignation. "When did you last take an evening for yourself?" The Duke blinked at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. "I don't have evenings for myself. There's always work to be done." "Then you're doing it wrong." Esperanza stepped into the study before she could second-guess herself. "Come with me." "Lady Blackwood." "Come with me, Your Grace." "That's not a request." To her surprise, he obeyed. Perhaps he was too tired to argue. Perhaps he was curious. Either way, he followed her through the darkened halls to the conservatory she had discovered weeks ago. She had spent the afternoon preparing. She'd cleaned the glass panels, watered the struggling plants, lit a dozen candles around the space. It was still shabby, still neglected, but it glowed with soft light and smelled of earth and growing things. "What is this?" the Duke asked. "This," Esperanza said, "is a reminder that there is more to life than ledgers and correspondence. This conservatory was beautiful once. It could be beautiful again. But only if someone takes the time to care for it." She wasn't just talking about the plants, and from the way the Duke looked at her, she suspected he knew it. They stood in the candlelit conservatory for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, the Duke reached out and touched one of the wilting plants. "My mother loved this room," he said quietly. "She died when I was 12. My father never came here again afterward. Neither did I." "I'm sorry," Esperanza said softly. "Don't be. It was a long time ago." But his hand remained on the plant, gentle in a way she'd never seen him be gentle. "I learned young that caring too much is dangerous. That love makes you weak. That the only way to protect what matters is to never let it matter too much." "And did that work?" Esperanza asked. "Did it keep you safe?" The Duke looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the man beneath the title, the lonely boy who had grown into a lonelier man, who had built an empire but couldn't remember why, who had married for strategy because he'd forgotten how to hope for anything else. "No," he admitted. "It didn't." Something shifted between them in that moment. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The acknowledgement that their strategic alliance might become something more if they were brave enough to let it. Spring came to Blackwood Keep. Under Esperanza's care, the conservatory bloomed back to life. But it wasn't just the plants that were growing. The Duke began joining her for evening tea in the conservatory. At first, they talked about estate business, safe, neutral topics. But gradually, the conversations deepened. He told her about his plans to modernize the northern textile mills, to create better conditions for the workers. She told him about her dreams of establishing a school for girls in the village, teaching them more than needlework and submission. They discovered they were both voracious readers, both lovers of strategic chess matches, both more comfortable with honesty than flattery. The Duke had a dry wit that surprised her into laughter. Esperanza had a directness that challenged him in ways no one had dared for years. "You're different than I expected," the Duke said one evening as they played chess in the library. "How so?" I thought you'd want the London season. The balls and galas. Instead, you seem content here. Esperanza moved her queen decisively. Check. And I am content. For the first time in my life, I have the freedom to be myself rather than performing whatever role is expected of me. That's worth more than 100 balls. The Duke studied the chessboard, then looked at her with something like admiration. You're going to win this game, aren't you? In 3 moves. You left your king exposed. I have a habit of doing that around you. The words were light, but his eyes were serious. Esperanza's breath caught. They sat in the lamplight library, the chessboard between them, and something unspoken but powerful hung in the air. This was the moment. The choice. They could retreat back into the safety of their arrangement, or they could risk something real. Stephen, Esperanza said softly, using his given name for the first time. I think we've been going about this all wrong. How so? We thought we were protecting ourselves by keeping distance. But maybe, she reached across the chessboard and placed her hand over his. Maybe we've just been protecting ourselves from living. The Duke, Stephen, turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. This marriage was supposed to be strategy. I don't know how to make it more. Then we'll figure it out together. No more distance. No more separate wings. No more pretending this is just business. Esperanza squeezed his hand. We're already partners in everything else. Why not in this? Stephen pulled her to her feet and, for the first time since their wedding, kissed her like he meant it. Not chaste or perfunctory, but deep and yearning and full of all the loneliness they'd both been carrying for far too long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Stephen rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to be terrible at this, he warned. Good thing I'm excellent at managing difficult projects. Esperanza smiled against his lips. Besides, I saw your ledgers. You're thorough when you commit to something. Are you comparing our marriage to bookkeeping? If the metaphor fits. Stephen laughed, actually laughed, and pulled her close. God help me, I think I'm in love with you. I know I'm in love with you, Esperanza replied. I have been since you offered me that impossible choice in the rain. You saw me at my worst moment and offered me power instead of pity. You gave me the space to be angry and strategic and uncompromising. You never asked me to be softer or sweeter or anything other than exactly who I am. That's because who you are is extraordinary. They stood in the library, holding each other, and rewrote the terms of their arrangement. Not a strategic alliance. Not a business partnership. But a real marriage, messy and complicated and absolutely worth the risk. 5 years later, Blackwood Keep hosted its first gala in a generation. The ballroom sparkled with candlelight. The finest families in England had made the journey north, curious to see the Duke and Duchess who had become legends in their own right, the woman who had destroyed Julian Vane and the man who had married her in defiance of all convention. Esperanza stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on Stephen's arm. Her silver blonde hair was elegantly arranged, her gown a deep sapphire that brought out the blue in her eyes. Beside her, Stephen looked every inch the powerful Duke, but when he looked at his wife, his expression softened in a way that made several ladies sigh romantically. Ready, he murmured. Always. Esperanza smiled up at him. Though I should warn you, our son has already charmed half the guests. He has your strategic mind and my theatrical instincts. We may have created a monster. Just one monster? Our daughter has 3 dowagers eating out of her hand, and she's not even 4 years old yet. They descended the stairs together, and the assembled guests burst into applause. Not because protocol demanded it, but because the love between the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood was impossible to miss. They had transformed the lonely keep into a place of warmth and laughter. They had used their power not just for profit but for progress, building schools and improving working conditions across their holdings. They had raised 2 children who were growing up understanding that strength and kindness were not opposites. Most importantly, they had proven that strategic alliances could become love stories if both parties were willing to be brave. As they reached the ballroom floor, Stephen pulled Esperanza close for the first waltz. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Esperanza thought back to that rainy night 5 years ago, to the moment she'd stepped into his carriage and chosen scandal over safety, power over propriety, him over everything else. "Not a single one," she said. "You?" Stephen kissed her forehead, right there in the center of the ballroom in front of everyone. "Scandal and propriety be damned. My only regret is that I didn't find you sooner." The orchestra played. The guests danced. And in the heart of Blackwood Keep, amidst the glittering chandeliers and whispered admiration, 2 people who had married for strategy celebrated a love that had become genuine, unbreakable, and entirely their own. The gilded mirrors of the vain ballroom reflected 1,000 lies. Esperanza Jensen watched them all multiply into infinity, the false smiles, the calculated glances, the whispered secrets hidden behind ivory fans. She stood beneath the largest chandelier, a vision in midnight silk that made her silver blonde hair gleam like captured starlight. Around her, London's elite swirled in a carefully choreographed dance of power and pretense, each masked face hiding ambitions as sharp as daggers. She had chosen her position deliberately. From here, she could see everything: the musicians in the corner playing their elegant waltz, the servants weaving through the crowd with champagne and delicacies, the velvet curtain that hung at the far end of the ballroom like a theatrical backdrop. And beyond that curtain, she knew, Julian Vane was already making his move with the young heiress whose dowry would replace her own. Lady Pemberton drifted past, her mask adorned with peacock feathers, her voice pitched just loud enough for Esperanza to hear. "Such a shame about Miss Jensen. They say the engagement is all but over. Julian's been seen with the Hartley girl, you know." Her companion, a woman in crimson with a fox mask, responded with practiced sympathy. Poor dear. To be cast aside at her own engagement celebration. How utterly humiliating. Esperanza took a measured sip of champagne, her expression serene. Let them think her oblivious. Let them believe she was the tragic heroine of this evening's entertainment, waiting in ignorance for the axe to fall. The truth was so much more satisfying. She had known for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since she'd discovered the forged documents. 6 weeks since she'd understood that Julian Vane never intended to marry her, only to ruin her family and steal her inheritance. For 6 weeks, she had played the devoted fiancé while methodically dismantling every lie he'd constructed, documenting every debt, securing every piece of evidence that would destroy him. Tonight was not her ending. It was his. Across the ballroom, she caught sight of Julian emerging from behind the velvet curtain. His cravat was slightly askew, his smile too bright, too confident. He thought himself untouchable. He thought her weak. In all their months together, he had never truly seen her, had never looked past the beautiful face and impeccable manners to recognize the mind that operated beneath. That would be his fatal mistake. The orchestra swelled into a new movement, and the crowd parted slightly. Through the gap, Esperanza saw Julian approaching, his hand extended, his expression that of a man about to deliver a killing blow disguised as kindness. Around them, the whispers intensified. She could feel the anticipation in the room, the cruel excitement of spectators awaiting a scandal. Esperanza set down her champagne glass with delicate precision. Her heart was steady, her hands calm. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she would not waste it on doubt or hesitation. Julian reached her side, that false smile never wavering. "My dear Esperanza," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed space. "We should speak privately. About our future." She smiled back at him, and it was the smile of a woman who held all the cards. "By all means, Julian. Let's discuss our future. Right here, where everyone can hear." The whispers stopped. The music faltered. And Esperanza Jensen prepared to turn the masquerade of lies into a theater of truth. Julian's hand closed around her elbow, his grip just tight enough to suggest ownership. "Darling, please. This is neither the time nor the place for dramatics." But Esperanza didn't move. She stood rooted beneath the chandelier, her voice carrying with crystalline clarity across the now silent ballroom. "On the contrary, Julian. This is precisely the time and place. You wanted an audience for my humiliation, didn't you? Let's give them a show." His face paled beneath his mask. Around them, 300 guests had stopped pretending not to stare. Fans froze mid-flutter. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the orchestra had fallen silent, violins suspended in mid-air as every eye turned toward the spectacle unfolding at the ballroom's heart. "You're being hysterical," Julian hissed, his charming facade cracking like porcelain. "We'll discuss this privately." "The £40,000 you borrowed against my dowry," Esperanza said, her tone conversational, almost pleasant. "Did you plan to discuss that privately as well? Or perhaps the 3 promissory notes you forged bearing my father's signature? The loans you secured from Lord Ashworth using my family's name as collateral?" The color that had drained from Julian's face now returned as a furious crimson. "You have no proof of such." "I have copies of every document." Esperanza withdrew a folded sheaf of papers from her bodice, holding them aloft like a banner of war. "Witnessed and notarized. I have testimony from the Hartley Banking House, from Whitmore and Sons, from the Royal Exchange. I have your private ledger, Julian. The one you kept in the false bottom of your desk. The one detailing every penny you intended to steal from me and my family." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Lady Pemberton's fan clattered to the floor. In the corner, Lord Ashworth stepped forward from the shadows, his expression transforming from curiosity to thunderous rage. Julian lunged for the documents, desperation replacing his practiced charm. "You little—" But Lord Ashworth's hand clamped down on Julian's shoulder with the force of a judge's gavel. "Not so fast, Vane. It seems you and I have business to discuss. Business involving my £45,000 you've been spending rather freely." "This is a misunderstanding," Julian stammered, his eyes darting around the ballroom like a trapped animal seeking escape. "She's vindictive, you see. Scorned. A woman's spite. A woman's intelligence," Esperanza corrected, her voice cutting through his excuses like a blade through silk. "You mistook composure for compliance, Julian. You believed that because I smiled at your lies, I swallowed them. You thought my silence meant acceptance rather than strategy." She took a step closer, and despite Lord Ashworth's grip on his shoulder, Julian flinched. "You were wrong about me from the very beginning. I was never the delicate flower you could pluck and discard. I was the gardener who knew exactly when to uproot the weeds." The metaphor landed with devastating precision. Across the ballroom, she could see the shift in perception, the reassessment happening behind every masked face. She was no longer the pitiable jilted bride. She was the woman who had outmaneuvered one of London's most notorious social climbers at his own game. "Lord Ashworth," Esperanza said, turning to address the furious nobleman directly. "I believe you'll find the magistrate most interested in Mr. Vane's creative accounting practices. As for the rest of you," she swept her gaze across the assembled crowd, letting them feel the weight of her judgment. "Consider this engagement dissolved. Permanently." She turned on her heel, her dark gown swirling around her like smoke, and walked toward the ballroom doors. Behind her, she heard Julian's protests devolve into pleading, heard Lord Ashworth's bark for someone to summon the authorities, heard the explosion of whispers that would fuel London gossip for months to come. Esperanza didn't look back. She had won. But as she stepped into the entrance hall and heard the first crack of thunder outside, she realized victory came with its own kind of isolation. She had burned every bridge to save her family's honor. Now she would face the consequences alone. The rain came down in sheets, turning the manor steps into rivers of water that soaked through Esperanza's silk gown within seconds. She stood at the edge of the portico, watching the storm transform London into a blur of grey and shadow. Behind her, the ballroom doors remained firmly closed, sealing her off from the scandal she'd just unleashed. Before her lay only the dark street and the question of where a woman who'd chosen victory over virtue could possibly go. Thunder rolled across the sky like a judgment. She had refused 3 separate offers of carriages, each accompanied by false sympathy and hungry eyes eager to mine her ruin for gossip. She would not give them that satisfaction. She would walk through this storm alone if she had to, just as she'd walked through the last 6 weeks alone, documenting Julian's lies while maintaining her perfect facade. The sound of hooves against cobblestone cut through the rain's relentless drumming. Esperanza looked up to see a carriage emerging from the downpour like something conjured from shadow and ambition. It was no ordinary vehicle. Black lacquered wood gleamed even in the storm, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the gaslight like dark water. Gold filigree traced elegant patterns across the door, and the crest mounted there was unmistakable, a crowned wolf with eyes that seemed to watch, to judge, to calculate. The crest of Blackwood. 2 midnight horses pulled the carriage with controlled power, their breath steaming in the rain-cooled air. The entire equipage radiated authority, wealth, and something more dangerous, the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. The carriage rolled to a stop directly before her, water splashing up from the wheels. For a moment, nothing moved except the rain. Then the door swung open with deliberate precision. Inside sat Stephen Cannon, Duke of Blackwood. Even in the shadowed interior, his presence dominated the space. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved from granite, dark eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing. They called him the Devil Duke in society's whispered conversations, a man who'd built an empire through ruthless calculation and who'd made enemies of anyone foolish enough to cross him. Julian Vane had crossed him once, years ago, over a business deal gone sour. The Duke had never forgotten. "Miss Jensen." His voice was a low rumble that somehow carried over the storm. "You've caused quite the spectacle tonight." Esperanza lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed even by the most formidable man in England. "I have no regrets, Your Grace." "I didn't suggest you should." Something flickered in those dark eyes, approval, perhaps, or recognition. "Get in the carriage." "I prefer to walk." "In this storm?" "To where, exactly?" He leaned forward slightly, and Esperanza could see the shrewd intelligence behind his aristocratic features. "Your family's door, where your father will lock you away in the country to preserve what remains of your reputation. A friend's house, where you'll be a charity case whispered about for the rest of your days. Or perhaps you plan to throw yourself on the mercy of London society, which just watched you destroy one of its own." Each question landed with the precision of a surgeon's blade, cutting away her illusions one by one. "I have a proposition," the Duke continued. "A marriage of convenience. You need a name powerful enough to weather any scandal. I need an heir and a hostess intelligent enough to navigate London's vipers without being devoured by them. You prove tonight that you possess both courage and cunning. Those are rare qualities, Miss Jensen. Valuable ones." Esperanza's breath caught. "You're proposing marriage? Now? To me? Especially to you." Julian Vane was a fool who couldn't recognize a strategic asset when he possessed one. "I am not Julian Vane." The Duke's expression remained unreadable, controlled. "This would be a business arrangement. You would have your own apartments, your own income, your own life. In exchange, you bear the Blackwood name and manage my social obligations. Your children, our children, would be among the most powerful in England. And if I refuse?" His hand rested on the door, ready to close it. "Then I wish you well with your alternatives. But decide now, Miss Jensen. This offer expires with the storm." Esperanza stood in the pouring rain, water streaming down her face, her carefully arranged hair falling in silver strands around her shoulders. Behind her lay the wreckage of everything she'd known. Before her sat a man offering not rescue but alliance, not love but power, not comfort but survival on her own terms. She thought of her mother, who'd married for love and died young and poor. She thought of her father, who would receive her with disappointment and shame. She thought of the woman she'd been tonight in that ballroom, fearless, strategic, unbreakable. Esperanza Jensen stepped forward and climbed into the Duke's carriage. The carriage door closed with a decisive click, sealing them into the shadowed interior. Esperanza settled onto the velvet seat across from the Duke, acutely aware of her soaked gown dripping onto his immaculate floor, her ruined hair, her complete lack of dignity. Yet when she met his gaze, she saw no judgment there, only the cool assessment of a man evaluating a business transaction. "You're shivering," Stephen observed, reaching for a blanket folded beside him. He passed it across the space between them with the same efficiency he might use to sign a contract. "I'm fine." But she took the blanket anyway, wrapping it around her shoulders. Pride had its limits, and hypothermia served no one's interests. The carriage lurched forward, and London began to slide past the rain-streaked windows. Stephen produced a silver flask from inside his coat and offered it to her without ceremony. "Brandy. You'll need it for what comes next." Esperanza took a small sip, feeling the burn spread through her chest. "And what comes next, Your Grace?" "You've made your offer, but we've hardly discussed the specifics of this arrangement." "Direct." "I appreciate that." He leaned back, his long frame somehow filling the entire carriage despite the physical distance between them. "The specifics are simple. We marry within the week, quickly, before London society can fully process what happened tonight. My name will shield you from the worst of the scandal. Your intelligence will serve my interests in navigating the social sphere I've long neglected. You're proposing we use each other. I'm proposing we benefit each other. There's a difference." His dark eyes fixed on hers with unsettling intensity. "You want protection and power. I want heirs and efficiency. Neither of us wants the messy complication of sentiment. It's a cleaner arrangement than most marriages I've observed." Esperanza took another sip of brandy, considering. "And Julian? You despise him. Surely marrying his disgraced former fiancé serves some purpose beyond acquiring a hostess." A ghost of a smile touched the Duke's lips, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. "You're perceptive." "Yes, I despise Julian Vane. He tried to cheat me in a shipping venture 3 years ago. Cost me £50,000 before I discovered his fraud. I've been waiting for an opportunity to return the favor ever since. And I'm that opportunity. You're more than that. You're proof that Julian Vane's greatest treasure, and make no mistake, you were his greatest prize, far more valuable than any dowry, chose me over him. Chose power over his pretty lies. That will destroy him more thoroughly than any financial ruin." Stephen's voice was cold, matter-of-fact. "I deal in complete victories, Miss Jensen. Partial ones bore me." There was something darkly honest about his ruthlessness that Esperanza found oddly comforting. At least he wasn't pretending to be her savior or suitor. He was offering her a weapon, and in exchange, she would be his. "What about love?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "What if one of us develops inconvenient feelings?" "We won't. We're both too intelligent for that particular delusion." He said it with the certainty of a man who'd made peace with emotional isolation long ago. Love is a luxury afforded to people who can survive its aftermath. Neither of us can. We've both learned that vulnerability is simply another word for weakness. Esperanza thought of her mother's love-struck marriage, her early death leaving Esperanza to navigate a cruel world alone. Agreed. Sentiment has no place in survival. Then we understand each other. Stephen extended his hand across the carriage, formal despite the intimacy of their enclosed space. A partnership of protection and mutual benefit. Your reputation preserved, my legacy secured. Julian Vane humiliated, your family's honor defended. No love, no illusions, no disappointments. Esperanza looked at his outstretched hand, strong, elegant, utterly without warmth. This was not the hand of a man who would write her poetry or whisper sweet promises. This was the hand of an empire builder, a strategist, a survivor who recognized another survivor when he saw one. She placed her hand in his. A partnership, then. No love, no illusions. His fingers closed around hers, sealing the agreement. We leave for Blackwood Keep at dawn. The north will be your new home, away from London's gossip and Julian's reach. I'll send word to my solicitors tonight to draft the marriage contracts. You'll have your own income, your own apartments, your own life within the structure of mine. How generous, Esperanza said, though there was no sarcasm in her voice. She understood what he was offering: freedom within constraint, power within partnership. It was more than most women ever received in marriage. Not generous. Strategic. Stephen released her hand and returned to his position across from her, the distance between them re-established. Trapped wives become vengeful wives. I prefer willing partners to resentful prisoners. The carriage rolled through the London night, carrying them both toward a future built on calculation rather than affection, on mutual benefit rather than mutual devotion. Esperanza stared out at the rain-blurred city and felt something unexpected settle in her chest, not happiness, precisely, but something close to peace. She had made her choice. She had chosen power over pity, strategy over sentiment, survival over surrender. And if the cost was a marriage without love to a man without warmth, well, she had never expected love anyway. At least this way, she would have her dignity. At least this way, she would have her revenge. 3 days of travel had transformed London's grey sophistication into something wild and untamed. Esperanza watched through the carriage window as the landscape shed its civilized veneer mile by mile, manicured estates giving way to rolling hills, then to windswept moors that stretched endlessly beneath storm-grey skies. The further north they traveled, the more the world seemed to narrow to just earth and sky and the relentless northern wind that bent everything in its path. She and Stephen had barely spoken during the journey. He spent his hours reviewing correspondence, his quill scratching across parchment with mechanical efficiency. She watched the changing landscape and tried not to think about what awaited her at journey's end. A stranger's house. A stranger's bed. A stranger's life that would somehow become hers. When Blackwood Keep finally emerged from the moorland, Esperanza's breath caught despite herself. The estate rose from the wild landscape like something conjured from Gothic imagination, all dark stone and narrow windows, turrets silhouetted against the heavy clouds like watchful sentinels. It was beautiful in a harsh, uncompromising way, making no apologies for its severity. The keep didn't invite. It commanded. It endured. Home, Stephen said quietly, the single word carrying unexpected weight. The carriage rolled through iron gates that looked strong enough to repel an army, then up a long drive lined with ancient oaks that had weathered centuries of northern storms. As they approached the main entrance, Esperanza noticed something unexpected: a conservatory attached to the eastern wing, its glass panels dusty and neglected, plants pressing against the windows like prisoners seeking escape. Stephen followed her gaze, and something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps. Or memory. My mother's project. She died before finishing it. It was the first personal thing he'd shared in 3 days. Esperanza filed it away, a small piece in the puzzle of the man who would be her husband. The staff assembled to greet them with formal precision, a housekeeper who introduced herself as Mrs. Blackwood, a stern butler named Graves, a handful of servants whose names blurred together in Esperanza's exhausted mind. They welcomed her with careful courtesy, their eyes betraying nothing but professional neutrality. She wondered what they thought of their master bringing home a scandal-soaked bride with barely a week's notice. Mrs. Blackwood will show you to your apartments, Stephen said, already turning toward the eastern wing. We dine at 8. I've had your trunk sent ahead from London. Stephen, Esperanza caught herself. Your Grace. Thank you. He paused, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. For what? For this. For offering me a way out when I had none. Something softened in his features, barely perceptible but there nonetheless. You would have found a way out regardless, I suspect. You're remarkably resourceful when cornered. Then he was gone, disappearing into the depths of his ancestral home like a ghost returning to familiar haunts. Mrs. Blackwood led Esperanza through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate, high ceilings, dark portraits of severe-looking ancestors, windows that let in grey northern light but little warmth. Yet there was beauty here too, if one knew how to look for it. The craftsmanship in the carved banisters. The quality of the tapestries. The evidence of generations who had built something meant to last. Your apartments, my lady, Mrs. Blackwood announced, opening double doors onto a suite that took Esperanza's breath away. The rooms were larger than her entire family home in London. A sitting room with a fireplace already blazing. A bedroom with a four-poster bed draped in deep blue velvet. Windows overlooking the moors, where she could see for miles. And books, shelves and shelves of books lining one entire wall. His Grace had the library brought up yesterday, Mrs. Blackwood explained, her stern expression softening slightly. Said you'd appreciate having something to occupy your time. Esperanza moved to the shelves, running her fingers along leather spines. Philosophy, history, science, poetry. Not the frivolous novels society expected women to read, but serious works chosen by someone who understood what she actually valued. Stephen had been watching her. Not just at those society events he'd mentioned, but closely enough to know what books would please her. Closely enough to anticipate her needs before she'd even agreed to marry him. Mrs. Blackwood, Esperanza said slowly, His Grace. What is he like? As a master, I mean. The housekeeper considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Fair. Exacting. He works himself to exhaustion managing the estate and his business concerns. Hasn't hosted a party or entertained guests since his father died 8 years ago. Keeps to himself, mostly. The staff respects him, though I can't say anyone really knows him. She paused. He's been alone a long time, my lady. Perhaps too long. After Mrs. Blackwood left, Esperanza stood at the window watching the sun set over the moors in shades of purple and gold. Somewhere in this vast house, Stephen Cannon sat alone in his study, working through ledgers and correspondence because work was safer than feeling, because isolation was safer than connection. She understood that impulse more than she cared to admit. She too had spent years building walls around herself, protecting her heart behind strategy and calculation. Perhaps that's what he'd recognized in her that rainy night. Not just intelligence or courage, but the familiar armor of someone who'd learned that caring too much was dangerous. The marriage would take place in 3 days. A cold transaction between two cold people. Yet as Esperanza touched the spines of the books he'd chosen for her, she wondered if perhaps their coldness was simply frozen warmth, ice that might melt under the right conditions. If someone were brave enough to apply heat. The library in Esperanza's apartments had become her refuge during the endless hours before the wedding. She spent her mornings exploring the shelves Stephen had so carefully curated, losing herself in philosophy and history, anything to avoid thinking about the cold ceremony that would bind her to a man she barely knew. On the third morning, while reaching for a volume of Marcus Aurelius on the highest shelf, her hand knocked against something hidden behind the row of books. A leather journal tumbled down, landing open at her feet. Esperanza knew she shouldn't read it. Whatever private thoughts it contained were not meant for her eyes. But the page it had fallen open to bore a date from 3 years ago, and written in Stephen's precise, elegant hand were 2 words that stopped her heart, Esperanza Jensen. She picked up the journal with trembling fingers and began to read. Attended the Pemberton ball tonight. Miss Esperanza Jensen was there, navigating the social sharks with more grace than they deserve. She has a way of listening that makes people reveal themselves, a rare quality. Most in our circles hear only what they wish to hear. She hears what is actually said. Dangerous trait. Admirable one. Esperanza sank into the window seat, the journal clutched against her chest. 3 years ago. Before Julian. Before everything. She flipped back through the pages, finding her name scattered throughout like seeds planted in careful rows. Miss Jensen refused Lord Hartley's advance tonight with such subtle precision he didn't realize he'd been rejected until an hour later. She has mastered the art of the velvet knife. Watched EJ manage her younger sister through the season. The girl is hopeless at cards, yet EJ taught her to read people instead of hands. She's building a strategist from unpromising material. Impressive. EJ wore grey tonight. Every other woman in peacock colors trying to outshine each other, and she chose grey. Understood that true power doesn't shout. It whispers. Page after page of observations, each one revealing how closely Stephen had watched her, how deeply he'd understood her, years before she'd even known he existed beyond reputation and rumor. He'd catalogued her intelligence, her strategic mind, her quiet strength. He'd seen her when no one else had bothered to look past her beauty to the blade beneath. But it was the final entry, dated 2 months before Julian's proposal, that made her breath catch. Julian Vane is circling EJ like a shark scenting blood. She's too clever not to see it, yet she permits his attention. Perhaps she sees something in him I don't. Perhaps I'm wrong about her judgment. Or perhaps, and this troubles me more, she knows exactly what he is and has already decided how to use it. If Vane touches her, if he harms her in any way, I will destroy him. Not for business reasons. Not for old grudges. But because London can ill afford to lose one of its few genuine minds to a parasitic fool. Esperanza closed the journal, her hands shaking. He'd been watching her for years. Protecting her from a distance. Waiting. And when Julian had finally made his move, when she'd finally sprung her trap at the masquerade, Stephen had been there with his carriage and his cold proposition, not because she was convenient or strategic, but because he'd been preparing for that moment for years. This wasn't a marriage of convenience. It was something far more complicated. She found him in his study, hunched over correspondence as always, his face illuminated by lamplight as the grey afternoon faded into evening. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his features. They'd maintained careful distance since arriving at the keep, each occupying their separate wings like opposing armies awaiting a treaty. Esperanza. Is something wrong? She held up the journal. This fell from behind the books in my apartments. The books you selected for me. The color drained from his face. For the first time since she'd met him, Stephen Cannon looked genuinely vulnerable. I didn't mean for you to find that. But I did. She moved closer, setting the journal on his desk between them like evidence at trial. 3 years, Stephen. You've been watching me for 3 years. Writing about me. Protecting me from men like Julian long before you ever offered me that carriage. I should explain. Yes. You should. Esperanza's voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Because this changes things. This changes everything. You told me this was a business arrangement. A strategic alliance. You said sentiment had no place in survival. Stephen stood, and she saw the wall slamming back into place behind his eyes, the Duke reasserting control over the man. It is a strategic arrangement. Those observations were simply due diligence. I observe everyone in London society. It's how I. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't lie to me now. Not after this. You wrote that London couldn't afford to lose me. You wrote that you would destroy Julian not for business but because she stopped, unable to finish the sentence because finishing it would make it real. Because I cared what happened to you, Stephen finished quietly, all pretense abandoned. Yes. I cared. I still do. But that doesn't change our arrangement, Esperanza. It doesn't change what this marriage is or isn't. Doesn't it? She stepped closer, close enough to see the conflict warring in his dark eyes. You've been lying to yourself, Stephen. Telling yourself you could watch me for years without feeling anything, that you could marry me as a business transaction when you've been half in love with me since the Pemberton ball 3 years ago. Love is a luxury I can't afford. That's what we both keep saying. But maybe we're wrong. Esperanza placed her hand over his where it rested on the desk. Maybe we're just afraid. Maybe all our talk of strategy and survival is just armor against the possibility that we might actually feel something real. Stephen looked down at her hand covering his, and something in his expression cracked. If I let myself feel, if I let you in, and something happens to you, I won't survive it. It's safer this way. Cleaner. Safer, Esperanza agreed softly. But lonelier. And we're already so lonely, Stephen. Both of us. Tomorrow they would marry in the chapel, bound by cold contracts and colder vows. But tonight, standing in the lamplight with his journals between them like a confession, Esperanza wondered if perhaps their frozen hearts had already begun the dangerous work of thawing. The marriage ceremony had been mercifully brief. No flowers, no celebration, just cold words spoken in a colder chapel while rain hammered against the stained glass windows. Esperanza had worn grey. Stephen had worn black. They'd exchanged vows like business partners signing contracts, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Stephen's kiss had been a chaste brush against her cheek that felt more like punctuation than passion. That had been 2 days ago. 2 days of careful distance, of separate wings and polite nods over breakfast. 2 days of pretending the conversation in his study had never happened, that his journals hadn't revealed years of longing disguised as observation. The letter arrived on the 3rd morning. Esperanza was in the library when she heard Stephen's roar of fury echo through the keepstone corridors. She'd never heard him raise his voice before. His anger had always been cold and controlled, a scalpel rather than a bludgeon. This was different. This was rage barely leashed. She found him in his study, the letter crumpled in his fist, his face a mask of controlled violence. That bastard. That absolute bastard. What happened? Stephen looked at her, and she saw something dangerous burning behind his eyes. Julian. His filed suit in London, claiming our marriage was obtained through coercion and fraud. His alleging that I forced you into the carriage that night, that you were in distress and not of sound mind to consent. His demanding the marriage be annulled and claiming damages for, his voice went deadly quiet. For loss of consortium. He's telling the courts you belong to him. The world tilted sideways. Esperanza gripped the edge of Stephen's desk to steady herself. He's trying to destroy me. If this goes to trial, if he drags my name through the courts claiming I was coerced. He's trying to destroy us both. Stephen moved around the desk with predatory grace, placing himself between her and the door as if Julian might materialize at any moment. A scandal-soaked bride is one thing. A potentially annulled marriage to a duke accused of coercion is something else entirely. He wants to paint me as a villain who took advantage of your distress, and you as a victim who needs his protection. I was never his. I was never anyone's but my own. Fury rose hot in Esperanza's chest, burning away the careful composure she'd maintained for days. How dare he? After everything he tried to do, after every lie and every forged document, he has the audacity to claim I need protection from you. He's using the law as a weapon because he lost the social battle. Stephen's jaw clenched. My solicitors can fight this, but it will take months, possibly years. The scandal will follow you, us, everywhere. London will feast on it. Then we fight back. Esperanza straightened, her strategic mind already cataloguing weapons and weaknesses. We give them a story they can't ignore. Not a cold marriage of convenience, but something else entirely. We become inseparable. Devoted. Disgustingly happy. We make Julian look like a bitter fool chasing a woman who chose someone else. You want us to lie? To perform affection. I want us to win. She stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Unless you think you can't be convincing. Unless the idea of pretending to care for me is so repugnant. Stephen moved so quickly she barely registered it. One moment they stood at arm's length, negotiating strategy like generals planning war. The next, his hands framed her face and his mouth crashed against hers with a desperation that stole her breath. This was not the chaste kiss from their wedding. This was years of watching and wanting compressed into a single moment of surrender. His fingers threaded through her hair, scattering pins, and she found herself gripping his shoulders like a lifeline as he kissed her with the intensity of a man who'd finally stopped lying to himself. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Stephen rested his forehead against hers. "Does that seem convincing enough?" "Stephen, I've been lying to myself." His voice was rough, stripped of its usual control. "Telling myself I could marry you and keep my distance. That I could share a house with you, share a name with you, and not want more. But when I read that letter, when I imagined Julian trying to take you away from me, I realized something." His hands trembled slightly where they cupped her face. "I don't want to pretend to care for you, Esperanza. I don't think I could stop caring for you if I tried. You wrote about me for 3 years," she whispered. "You chose books you knew I'd love. You offered me a carriage in the rain when you could have let me drown in scandal. This was never just strategy, was it?" "No." The admission seemed to cost him everything. "God help me, no. You walked into that ballroom 3 years ago and I've been lost ever since. I watched you survive Julian's lies with your dignity intact. I watched you play chess with vipers and win. I watched you choose truth over comfort, and I knew," he stopped, swallowing hard. "I knew I'd never find anyone like you again." Esperanza felt something crack open in her chest, all the careful walls she built around her heart crumbling like sand before a tide. "I thought love was weakness. I thought caring too much would destroy me. Maybe it will." Stephen's thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "But I'm tired of surviving, Esperanza. I'm tired of being safe and cold and alone. If Julian wants to challenge this marriage, let him. We'll fight him together. Not as strategic partners, but as husband and wife," she finished. "Real ones." He kissed her again, slower this time, thorough and claiming and full of promise. When he finally pulled back, his expression held something she'd never seen there before, hope. "We'll go to London," Stephen said. "Face Julian and his lawyers together. Show them exactly what kind of marriage this is." And then, he paused, vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. "And then maybe we can stop pretending this was ever just business." Esperanza smiled against his lips. "Maybe we already have." Outside, the northern storm raged against Blackwood Keep's ancient stones. But inside Stephen's study, 2 people who'd married for strategy finally admitted they'd been falling toward something far more dangerous from the very beginning. And this time, neither of them was afraid. London had changed in the month since Esperanza left it in scandal. Or perhaps she had changed, and London simply reflected that transformation back at her. She descended from the Blackwood carriage wearing deep sapphire silk, her hand resting possessively on Stephen's arm, and felt the weight of 1,000 stares assessing, judging, recalibrating their understanding of who she was and what she'd become. The Duchess of Blackwood. Not a disgraced bride, but one of the most powerful women in England. Their first appearance was at the Ashworth Ball, deliberately chosen because Lord Ashworth had been one of Julian's primary creditors and had watched Esperanza's public triumph at the masquerade. When they entered the ballroom, conversation didn't just pause, it stopped entirely, as if someone had frozen time itself. Stephen's hand covered hers where it rested in the crook of his elbow. "Ready?" "Always." She smiled up at him, and it wasn't the strategic smile she'd once used as armor. It was genuine, warm, the smile of a woman who knew she was loved and loved fiercely in return. They'd practiced this on the journey south, not the affection, which had become as natural as breathing, but the performance of it. The way Stephen would look at her as if she were the only person in the room. The way she would touch his face with casual intimacy. Small gestures that broadcast to London's gossip-hungry elite that this marriage was emphatically not one of convenience. Lord Ashworth approached first, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace. Your Grace. Welcome back to London." "Lord Ashworth." Stephen's voice carried the weight of ducal authority. "I trust you received my solicitor's response to Mr. Vane's rather creative legal filing." "I did indeed." A smile ghosted across Ashworth's weathered features. "I also received a rather interesting letter from Vane himself, asking me to support his suit by testifying that you coerced the Duchess that evening. I declined, of course. I was there, you see. I watched Her Grace systematically destroy him with evidence and intelligence. The only person coercing anyone that night was Vane himself, attempting to coerce your wife into silence about his fraud." The words carried across the hushed ballroom like ripples across still water. Esperanza felt the shift in the room's energy, the recalibration happening in real time. Lord Ashworth, one of London's most respected peers, had just publicly declared himself on their side. "Thank you, my lord," Esperanza said quietly. "Your support means more than you know." "Nonsense. I'm simply stating facts." Ashworth's eyes glinted with something that might have been approval. "Besides, Vane cost me £45,000 with his schemes. I'm rather enjoying watching his latest gambit fail spectacularly." The evening progressed like a carefully orchestrated campaign. Stephen introduced Esperanza to business associates who'd never bothered with social niceties before but now showed genuine respect. She charmed dowagers who'd written her off as scandalous, winning them over with intelligence and grace rather than desperate pleading. Together they moved through London society like a force of nature, reshaping perceptions with every conversation, every shared glance, every casual touch that screamed intimacy. Julian himself appeared near midnight, looking haggard and desperate in a way that would have once satisfied Esperanza's need for revenge. Now she felt only pity. He'd lost everything, his reputation, his prospects, his freedom, and still he clung to the delusion that he could somehow win back what he'd never truly possessed. "Esperanza," he said, positioning himself in her path when Stephen had stepped away to speak with the Prime Minister. "You don't have to do this. If he's forcing you." "Forcing me?" She laughed, the sound cutting through his desperation like a blade. "Julian, you still don't understand, do you? I chose Stephen. Not because I had no options, but because he offered me what you never could, genuine partnership. Respect. The freedom to be exactly who I am without pretense or apology. He's using you for revenge against me." "No." Stephen's voice came from behind Julian, low and dangerous. He'd returned, positioning himself at Esperanza's side with the protective instinct that had become second nature. "You have that precisely backward. She's not my weapon against you. You were simply the obstacle in my path to her. And now you're not even that. You're nothing, Vane." A cautionary tale mothers will tell their daughters about men who mistake cruelty for cleverness. Julian's face flushed crimson. "This isn't over. The courts will. The courts will dismiss your suit by week's end." Stephen's tone carried absolute certainty. "I have testimony from Lord Ashworth, statements from 24 witnesses at the masquerade, and documentation proving you attempted to defraud not just Esperanza's family but 7 other prominent houses. Your solicitor has already advised you to withdraw the claim. The only question is whether you do so quietly or whether I'm forced to introduce all that evidence publicly." "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Stephen smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd already won. "By all means, find out. I've been waiting years for an excuse to destroy you completely, Julian. Please give me a reason." For a long moment, Julian stood frozen, trapped between pride and survival. Then something broke in his expression, the final surrender of a man who'd bet everything and lost. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like a ghost fading at dawn. Esperanza watched him go and felt nothing but relief. This chapter of her life was finally, irrevocably closed. Stephen's arm encircled her waist, pulling her close. "Are you all right?" "More than all right." She turned in his embrace, aware of the dozens of eyes watching them, and rose on her toes to kiss him softly. "I'm free. We both are." The music swelled around them as Stephen led her onto the dance floor, and Esperanza understood that this was their real triumph. Not Julian's defeat, though that was satisfying. Not London's acceptance, though that was useful. But this, the two of them moving together in perfect synchronization, no longer hiding behind strategy and walls, no longer afraid to claim what they'd found in the cold northern halls of Blackwood Keep. They had come to London to defend their marriage. Instead, they'd proven to themselves that it was worth defending. And that made all the difference. 5 years had transformed Blackwood Keep from a monument to loneliness into something that pulsed with life. Esperanza stood at the conservatory window, the conservatory she and Stephen had restored together, room by room, plant by plant, memory by memory, watching their children play in the fresh snow that blanketed the moors in crystalline white. Alexander, their eldest at 4, was teaching his sister Catherine the proper technique for building snow fortifications. Even at 3, Catherine showed signs of inheriting both her father's strategic mind and her mother's refusal to accept limitations. She was currently ignoring her brother's instructions entirely and building what appeared to be a snow castle instead. "She's going to be trouble," Stephen murmured, materializing behind Esperanza and wrapping his arms around her waist. Even after 5 years of marriage, his touch still sent warmth flooding through her chest. "She's going to be extraordinary." Esperanza leaned back against him, marveling at how natural this had become, the casual intimacy, the comfortable silence, the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Just like her father. Flattery. But she could hear the smile in his voice. "Alexander has your theatrical instincts." He narrated their entire breakfast this morning as if he were addressing Parliament. "God help us when they're old enough for London society." God help London society. Stephen pressed a kiss to her temple, his hand settling over her still flat stomach where their third child grew. They hadn't told the children yet, wanting to savor the secret between themselves a little longer. Through the conservatory glass, Esperanza could see the evidence of everything they'd built together. The school she'd established in the village, where girls learned mathematics and philosophy alongside needlework. The modernized textile mills that had become models of fair labor practices, drawing visitors from across England who wanted to understand how profit and compassion could coexist. The winter gala they now hosted annually, not the cold political affairs of Stephen's father's era, but celebrations of genuine warmth where laughter echoed through the keep's ancient halls. "Do you ever regret it?" Stephen asked quietly. "Stepping into that carriage? Trading one scandal for another, one uncertain future for a different one." Esperanza turned in his arms, studying the face that had become more beloved to her than her own reflection. Silver touched his temples now, and smile lines creased the corners of his eyes, evidence of a man who'd learned to feel again, to laugh again, to let himself be vulnerable. "Never. Not once. Not even when I was insufferable about the conservatory restoration? I believe you called me more stubborn than the moorland stone. Especially not then." She reached up to trace those smile lines, marveling that she'd helped put them there. "You know what I was thinking that night? Standing in the rain, watching your carriage approach? I thought you were offering me survival. A name powerful enough to withstand scandal. Security without warmth, power without passion. And now? Now I know you were offering me everything I didn't know I needed." Her voice caught slightly. "You saved my reputation, yes. But more than that, you saved me from becoming the cynical, defensive woman I was turning into. You taught me that love wasn't weakness, it was the bravest thing two broken people could choose." Stephen's arms tightened around her. "You're the one who saved me, Esperanza. I was drowning in ledgers and loneliness, convinced that caring too much was dangerous, that isolation was safer than connection. You walked into my study with those journals and forced me to admit what I'd been denying for years. We saved each other, then. We did." He kissed her softly, thoroughly, the way he did every morning and every night, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was real. Every single day, we keep saving each other. Outside, Alexander had apparently surrendered to Catherine's vision. They were now both working on the snow castle, his military fortifications abandoned in favor of her more imaginative architecture. Mrs. Blackwood appeared with hot chocolate and stern warnings about catching cold, but her expression was soft with affection as she watched the children. "Your mother would have loved this," Esperanza said, remembering the portrait she'd seen of the previous Duchess, Stephen's mother, who had died before finishing her beloved conservatory. "All of it. The children, the warmth, the way you've transformed the keep into a home. She would have loved you." Stephen's voice was thick with emotion. "The way you refused to let me hide behind coldness and strategy. The way you made me believe that frozen things could thaw, that damaged hearts could heal." They stood together in the conservatory as snow fell softly over the moorland, their children's laughter drifting through the glass, the future they'd built together stretching out before them like an unwritten story full of promise. The keep that had once been a fortress against feeling had become a sanctuary for it. The marriage that had begun as strategy had become the truest thing either of them had ever known. "Do you remember what you said to me in the carriage?" Esperanza asked. "That first night, when I climbed in soaking wet and terrified." "I said many things." "You said this would be a partnership? No love, no illusions, no disappointments." She smiled against his chest. "You were wrong about all of it. Spectacularly wrong." Stephen laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Thank God." "Thank God," Esperanza agreed. Outside, their children built castles in the snow, creating something beautiful from cold and formless things. Inside the conservatory, their parents held each other close and did the same, two people who'd married for protection and found transformation instead, who'd stepped into a carriage seeking survival and discovered that sometimes the greatest courage is not in staying frozen but in daring to thaw. The Duke and Duchess of Blackwood had become a legend in London society, the woman who'd destroyed her fraudulent fiancé and the man who'd offered her his carriage in a storm. But the real story, the one they whispered to each other in the quiet northern nights, was simpler and more profound. Two lonely souls had found each other in the rain and decided that love, despite all its risks and vulnerabilities, was worth the gamble after all. And every day since, they'd proven themselves right.